In today's video, we will learn what are kinematics equations, how do you know which equation to select to solve a problem, and how do we write the equations for vertical versus horizontal motion. Let's get started. So you can see that the main difference between horizontal and vertical motion is just switching between the x-axis and the y-axis because x is going to be horizontal going left or right and vertical is going to be y going up and down. So in order to select this equation, you want to have three of the following things to use. Either displacement or position values, initial velocity, acceleration, and time. My students often ask me, okay, I know what the equations are, but when do I select the specific one to use? The way that I've named them is based on what you should be looking for. If you have or want a specific portion of an object's position, or if you're solving for its displacement, this is an equation to consider. Another thing is you may be trying to solve for time. Usually the initial velocity is 0 meters per second if you're solving for time, because if it isn't, you may have to use the quadratic formula in order to solve. And this is often an equation that you start with when you're solving for free fall and projectile motion. So again, if you're looking at that unit in your physics class, this may be a good equation to keep in your back pocket. The next equation is oftentimes associated with velocity, and it's really just another way to write out the equation for acceleration. So in this case here, we have our final velocity is equal to our initial velocity plus acceleration times time. And you need to have three of the following for this equation. As you can see, initial velocity, final velocity, acceleration, and time. So you want to make sure you have three of those things to solve. Now, in this case, we want to use this in particular when we have or want velocity information. Because 2 out of 4 of the variables are associated with velocity, this is going to be a good one to consider. And the main difference between this and the third equation is the time factor. So if you have information about velocity and time, this is really going to be the equation that you should be looking to use. This is often used to solve for final velocity for an object that has a known acceleration. Going into our last equation, we have the velocity and displacement equation. Notice that this equation looks rather similar to the other one, where it has the final velocity is equal to the initial velocity. The key thing to see here, though, is that those values are squared. And so in this case, we have the relationship between velocity, acceleration, and instead of time, we have position through displacement. So in this case here, you're going to want to know things about the object's position or displacement, initial velocity, final velocity, and acceleration. One to use. This is a really great equation to use when you want position or displacement, but unlike our first equation we looked at, you don't have time. The other thing to consider is you may want to use this equation when you want velocity, but again, you may not have time. And so this is the main thing that causes the last equation to stand out. The other two equations either include ways to look at both parts of velocity, and they both look at acceleration. However, the main difference is, are you looking at position data? Or are you looking at time data in relation to those things? So if I were to summarize this, so you're working on a physics problem in class, you see your equation sheet, you see these equations, and you're trying to figure out what to do. Well, because these equations have some overlap, you really want to go back to the idea of what do you know or what can you solve for, right? So in this case, think to yourself first, what am I trying to find? Because you want to pick an equation that has the thing you're trying to solve for. Then you're going to say to yourself, what do I have? If you have displacement, you should be looking at the first or last equation. If you have final velocity information or you want it, you should be looking at the middle or last equation. And if you have time or you want time, you should be looking at the first two equations. Because notice that all of the equations have initial velocity and acceleration. So when you're deciding which equation to use, look at the other factors. That's all I have for you in this video, but in our upcoming videos, what I'm going to do is show you examples of how you go through the process of deciding what equation to use. As always, please remember that your growth will be found in the journey rather than in the solution. So get out there and go do some physics problems. I'll see you in the next video.